Good evening. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our webinar all about creating a bird-friendly space. Noticed some messages in the chat box about the snow that's happening. So it's nice on this evening when the snow is coming down to still be talking about plants and the spring that we know is just around the corner. We're so excited to have you join us to learn more about turning your yard or any area into a mini sanctuary for birds and pollinators from Michelle Serreyn and Ava Landgraf. My name is Sarah Helsin. I am the program coordinator for Detroit Audubon, and we are an organization dedicated to fostering the appreciation and conservation of birds and the environment that we share. We could not do the work that we do without our funders and members, so I wanted to make sure to say thank you to those of you who are members and supporting projects like this. Some quick Zoom housekeeping before we begin today. You are able to control your video and microphone in the bottom left of your screen. We ask that you keep yourself muted so that we do not receive feedback from your microphones. You can see closed captioning today by clicking on live transcript on the bottom of your screen. You can open the chat box by clicking on the chat button on the bottom of your screen. And we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please add any questions you might have to the chat. We are also recording the webinar today, and it will be shared via email in the next week or two, and you can also find it on the Detroit Audubon YouTube channel. If you have any further questions, please reach out to me and I will do my best to assist you. Michelle Serreyn is a native plant enthusiast and Wayne State student, and Ava Landgraf is our research coordinator at Detroit Audubon. Thank you and welcome, Michelle and Ava.
Hi there, thank you so much. Sorry, my internet just dropped out at the perfect timing. So give me a second while I reshare my screen with the PowerPoint on it. All right. Okay. Oh, and my name is Rochelle. Well, my name is actually Ava Landgraf. I'm the research coordinator for Detroit Audubon. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sarah, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? We're all good. Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you for joining us. Creating a space that benefits both birds and people is one of my life passions. I love birds and I love plants. When I think about creating space for birds, I used to really think a lot more about bird feeders and birdhouses, but now I've learned that so much more has to do with our native plants and limiting some of the dangers caused by people for birds. So today we're going to cover all of that and more, and I'm excited to share it with you. So to start things off, I just want to bring up this study that was released, I think back in 2019, that showed some of the just crazy drastic drops in bird population decline. When this study came out, it was really kind of like an alarm bell for a lot of people. Especially birders and bird watchers, to see just such a giant decline in the numbers of birds. So the main point of the study was that about 2.5 billion migratory birds have been lost since 1970. And then that number for birds in general is even larger. But I wanted to focus on migratory birds because these little birds are the birds that can really benefit by creating habitat for them in spaces like our yards or in a park or any small spaces like that. We can work to protect these birds. So another part of the study was showing that all this whole kind of circle pie chart right here in red, these are all of the kind of families of birds that had large declines in population. But then this little circle at the bottom shows the birds that were have actually had population increases. And so the birds that we have down here, we have like turkeys and raptors and ducks and geese. And those are birds that we've actually been putting a lot of time into saving their habitat and working to save the resources that they need. A lot of that is because of hunters actually have been doing a lot of work to keep the like turkeys and game birds around. So these birds have benefited. So this shows us that it is possible. If we put the time and save the space, we can help these bird populations bounce back. So now we have to do a similar thing with all these little guys, like our finches, our flycatchers, our little American sparrows. Like these guys all need help, and they all depend on us to create these little pieces of habitat to make one big habitat for them. So shown in that study that I was just talking about, the number one huge thing affecting birds is habitat loss. They're just losing the places where they can live, and since they don't have the right place to live, they also don't have the resources that they need to survive. So place and food, especially food to be feeding all of their chicks during the breeding season. So 54% of the US is now developed as suburban or urban area. And that's just a crazy amount of land compared to what the land used to be, just all wildlife habitat. And then on top of this, we also have to think about all the land that is now used for farming and agriculture. So within the US, there's very, very little space that is now available for wildlife. But we also have this number 54% that is suburban and urban, and that's all an area where we can make that area more suitable to the birds. And so, you know, this 54% doesn't have to be a huge loss of habitat. It can be more of a gain if we do the right things with the spaces that we own and make an effort to create habitat. Sarah, I don't know if you can see, it looks like we have a couple people in the waiting room, but I don't want to try to let them in. It's messing me up. Okay, so
I'm not a co-host, so that's why I can't let them in. So you do need to make me.
Oh, okay. Give me 1 second to let these people in.
Sorry, thank you.
Press all their names. While I'm letting people in. So I like to start things off with kind of the bad news for everybody. These are the things that we have to think about when we're creating space for birds, that in order to create a safe space, we have to think about some of the things that we bring into the space. So the main things here are the outdoor cats, problem windows that birds fly into, and the use of pesticides or other chemicals. And I am still letting people in from the waiting room. Let me see. Okay, I think I got everyone. Hopefully. Sorry about that, everyone. So we're starting things off with cats. I'm a cat lover. I have a bunch of kittens in my house right now because I'm a foster parent right now. But cats do really horrible things for our bird populations. This chart here over on the left side is just, it's so unbelievable to me, these numbers. So over here you can see this is the number of birds that are killed by cats right here. Next we have window collisions, and then we have automobiles, power lines, wind turbines. Wind turbines, you know, that like people talk about all the time, they're all the way here, this tiny little bit, and this green bar is all of the birds that are killed by outdoor and feral cats. It's something that's really hard to talk about because we love our cats, and it's a hard thing to try to manage, trying to take care of our birds and also being good with cats. And, you know, we want to help the cats that are outside, and there's the trap, neuter, and release program and other programs like that. And it's just a very, very difficult situation for animal lovers in general because we care about both of them. But the easy thing right now is that if you do adopt a new cat, just please make the decision to keep that cat as an indoor cat. my mom grew up with outdoor cats all the time. And so when I was little, we had outdoor cats. But then as we got new cats when I was growing up, we made the choice that they would be indoor cats. And, you know, I think their life is probably a little bit less exciting, but they're also much safer and they live much longer lives. So it's a trade-off. And we do like to keep bird feeders around so our cats can still be entertained looking out the windows. The next thing to talk about is also another doozy. It's hard to talk about, hard to take action about, is all of the windows. So windows kill around 600 million birds a year in the US, and a lot of these deaths come from the like residential housing windows. And that's really hard. So if you imagine each house, and each house kills just a couple birds because a couple birds fly into the window and die. And then you multiply that by all of the houses, that ends up being a huge, huge number. So, you know, it's something where we have to think about which windows are the most problematic. And sometimes make our windows a little bit less nice looking by putting lines on them or something like that, so that the birds can see them and so that they're not flying into them. So here are a couple options. This is a picture of the Ethiopian bird savers, I believe, and they're these kind of like strings that hang down. And I think they're a really nice option because they're not super noticeable and they're easy to set up. And there's something that, you know, it really doesn't obscure your view of the outside too much. But there's some other options. There's little tiny dots that you can put on your windows, or like a kind of like this perforated sheet that is actually super unnoticeable from the inside. And then you can also use like China marker or soap or finger paint to draw. You can draw like a design on the windows as well. The only tricky thing is that the lines of whatever drawing or the lines that you have hanging down have to be spaced pretty close together, or the birds see that and think that they can still fly through. So unfortunately it does, you know, it's we can't just stick one little sticker on the window and call it good. We have to do much more so that the birds realize that it's a surface that they can't fly into.
Quick question, Ava. Someone asked if screens help.
Yeah, screens do help, and that's something I'm like being like, wow, thank God. Like those screens can be really helpful, especially if the screen is on the outside. The screens are great, and I was just looking at my window. I have a screen on part of it. So yeah, the screens are really nice. Especially on the outside, because another kind of factor of this is if you have the markings or the screen or the strings hanging down on the inside of your window, the bird can still see its reflection, or like the reflection of the trees and stuff on the other side of the window. So any markers or tape or drawings, all of that needs to be on the outside. But yes, screens are a great way that actually saves a lot of birds from running into our windows. And then this is almost kind of the hardest part, is that when we set up bird feeders or create space for birds, we are bringing them closer to our windows. And so we are kind of bringing them into a more dangerous environment. So there are some things that we can do about that. You know, you can keep your bird feeders actually closer to the window. And that way, if the bird is leaving the bird feeder and flies into the window, it hasn't moved far enough to build up that much speed. So it might hit the window, but it won't hit it as hard. That's just something to consider if you do decide to have bird feeders near a large window. It really is the responsible thing to do to make sure that that window is made bird safe. Lastly, just have to think about pesticides. Birds eat bugs, birds need bugs. Almost all birds in the US, most of the species here feed their babies bugs, lots of caterpillars and things like that. So if we use pesticides to kill all of the bugs, you're killing all of the birds' food. So it's just, it's just not an option. And then the chemicals and even like herbicides for weeds or even fertilizers on your lawn can still be really harmful, and those can be eaten by the little insects, and then the birds eat the insects, and it goes down the food chain. So we have to be careful with pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, all of that. Okay, now we're done with the really sad stuff. Sorry we had to go through that, but it is necessary. So part 2 is what I think of as like the classics. So we have bird baths, bird feeders, and bird houses. So to start things off, bird bath is a great way to bring some birds in. It can just be a dish of water, so super cheap. The only thing with a bird bath is that it's important to make sure that it's just kept clean with fresh water. This picture is like kind of like a little bubbler system here, and I've heard that like the sound of water moving can really bring birds in, and so that can be a great way to bring in kind of new species and new birds into your area. Like I said, keeping the water fresh and clean is really important. You don't, if you have cats or dogs around, you want to kind of try to keep the water lifted up so that the cats and dogs can't drink from it, because there's a lot of bacteria in their mouth. And if it gets into the water, it could just possibly get into a bird. So it's just safer to keep cats and dogs away from the water. Water in winter is super important. Even though snow is just a form of water, the birds would have to use energy to melt the snow in order to drink it. So a bird bath in the wintertime is really appreciated by the birds, and they love it. Whether you're able to have a heated bird bath or you just warm up some water and put warm water in a dish, and it'll cool off, but at least for maybe an hour or so, the birds have that water source. Now we have bird feeders. I really like using the Niger, also called thistle seed, and those are so little, and by being so small, they feed these little birds, and they don't attract the house sparrows or starlings as much, which are invasive species that we would rather not encourage. And then the thistle, it also kind of helps make not too much of a mess. If you're worried about like squirrels or rats getting to your feeders and eating the bird seed on the ground, it's a good option for that just because it's so little. The whole sunflower seeds or the safflower seed, I think those are really good options too. They kind of help support more of our birds, like these woodpeckers and the cardinals, blue jays, those birds with like a thick bill. And again, they're not as interesting to the house sparrows and starlings. The house sparrows and starlings, they like the millet seed and the cracked corn. So that's stuff that you kind of want to stay away from, since we don't really want to encourage those invasive species as much. Also very important to keep your feeders clean, especially because of a sickness that's been kind of going around the past couple of years. It's called finch eye syndrome. And so if you do see a finch at your bird feeder that has like swollen or crusty eyes, it could have finch eye syndrome. And if you do see that, you want to take down your feeders for a week or so, because you really don't want to be spreading that around the birds. So yeah, if you do choose to keep bird feeders out, it's really important to keep them clean. You can help keep them a little bit cleaner by using less seed at a time and just kind of refreshing it more often instead of like filling it up and just letting it sit for a week. And then again, if you're concerned about seeds on the ground, there's these blends called the no mess blend, where it's just all the insides of the seeds, and so there's no shells that are falling to the ground. And they can be more expensive, but for some people it's totally worth it. And those can be found at Wild Birds Unlimited and other stores, specialty stores like that. Oh, and hummingbird food. Hummingbird food really is just water and sugar to put in a hummingbird feeder. Some people recommend using the like red food coloring, but I don't think that's necessary at all. The like coloring of the red or yellow plastic is what is going to attract them, and there could be things in the red food dye, and the birds are just so little and delicate. It's better to just leave it only sugar and water. And then the same as all the others, it's really important to keep these clean, especially with the sugar. It can grow mold or attract other like little insects. So just very important to clean these regularly, put fresh food in regularly to keep your hummingbirds nice and healthy. For Orioles, there's been a lot of people putting out oranges for them, and they love that, and it's super fun. Obviously, they're a really beautiful bird. Some people also suggest using grape jelly, and they say that the birds really like it, but the oranges are just a lot healthier for them. The jelly can be a lot of sugar, and it can also have other ingredients in there that we don't really know about that could be bad for the birds. So it's just safer to stick with the oranges. And this is a big thing when talking about birds or feeding birds. You know, a lot of people have problems with the squirrels, and people are worried about like the rats coming around at night. And if you're concerned about that, then I would say then just stick to native plants, because those do not feed the squirrels and don't feed the rats. You're just feeding the birds. So you can keep it simple. You also don't have to clean your native plants. So it can be a much better option than keeping out a feeder. Then we have last in this section, nesting boxes and birdhouses. These are just, I mean, super fun, but also a couple downsides to them as well. They do need to be cleaned regularly, and the birds do get little nest parasites that live in like the nesting material. So when you do clean them out, you'll just want to make sure that you wear gloves. The other tricky part with the nest box is that the invasive species like the house sparrows and the European starling really like the nest boxes, and they are also really tough, aggressive birds that will fight the other birds and kick them out of the nest box. So the nest boxes can be more useful depending on where you are. If you live in a really populated area, like I live in the city, if I put up a nest box, I'm pretty sure the only thing that would move in would be these house sparrows. And the house sparrows are so aggressive that even if another bird did move in, the house sparrows would very likely kill that bird and make the nest on top of them. They're just tough little things. So the nest boxes are really a lot better for if you're in like a park or closer to a wildlife area, or have a house with not a lot of other houses around it. That's where these birds don't like those kind of more natural areas. They really thrive where we have a lot of people. So it kind of depends on your area if it's worth putting up a nest box or not. There are a couple ways that you can try to keep the house sparrows and starlings out of the box, but I don't think there's any like great foolproof method yet. So this is one method that I think has been kind of developed by the people that are doing bluebird nest boxes. And they said that like having these little streamers outside the box can help kind of scare the sparrows away. That is kind of iffy. And then this in the middle is not for the house sparrows and starlings, but it's just a predator guard, which can be really helpful for like raccoons or cats or snakes. Definitely a good line of protection. And then lastly here, this is just an example of a nest box that has the little, this little metal cover kind of around the hole. And that just keeps it so like squirrels can't chew all around that hole and kind of open it up more. So that just helps keep the hole small, and that way like larger animals like the squirrels and whatever else can't get into the box and use it for themselves. You can kind of limit who's able to get in there. There is this really fun website, Right Bird, Right House. I cannot remember exactly what the link is, but I will put that link on the handout that we're going to send to you later so that you can look it up. They have a couple different options of nest boxes that you can make. And these are also really nice because they have some of these different designs, and these can be nicer if you do have a lot of the house sparrows or starlings around you. These wouldn't really be used by the house sparrows and starlings. This one with the robin is really cute. This could be a really good one if you are in a more urban environment, but you want to have, invite a robin into your yard to raise its babies. This is a really nice design. And then this little thing here is so cute on the left. It's like a little cup nest that can be used by barn swallows. So there's options for nest boxes for birds and different species. Lastly is nesting material. And my aunt actually got me for Christmas, got me like it was this little kind of twine ball thingy, and on the inside was a bunch of alpaca hair or alpaca fur or wool, and it was so that the birds could pull that and take it back to their nest and use it for bedding. And that's so cute, and I think that's great. But then there was mention of using dryer lint in it once the alpaca hair runs out, and that's something you definitely don't want to do because of like the chemicals and other not natural things that could be in the dryer lint. So yeah, stick to natural materials like alpaca fur, or if you like brush your dog or cat and haven't applied any, I don't know, like any products, like a flea treatment or anything onto their hair, that can be nice to just let that fly away as nesting material. But just be careful about using dryer lint. You don't want to do that. And then also like little pieces of string, the little tiny pieces of string can get wrapped around the bird's legs and can get infected, and that's just really bad. So that is, don't use little pieces of string. So just a couple things to watch out for if you want to offer nesting material to your birds. Okay, now the third part of our presentation, we are now getting into plants and vegetation, and especially native plants. So before we get into native plants, we got to talk about lawns and how useless they are for our birds. Lawns have zero ecological benefit. They really came about as kind of US American people wanted to look like the fancy European people who had lawns to show off that they didn't have to grow their own veggies. So it was a way to show that you are rich. And it kind of still works as something kind of like that. But so we're trying to change the idea of lawns and use other plants to create something that gives like a nice, cared for look is really what we want. There's, on top of just like the grass has no ecological benefit, lawns require fertilizer, they require a lot of pesticides and way too much water. You know, we don't have water to be wasting on turf grass. And then on top of all of that, turf grass has little tiny roots, and that little root system barely takes up any water when there's like when there's a big, like a downpour of water during a storm or something. So in a lot of areas in Detroit and around Detroit, we have problems when we have big storms with like stormwater backup. And we can really help that by using more native plants that can soak up that water when we get like a big unleashing of water, whereas this grass really doesn't do anything, does not help take care of that storm water, and leads to our basements flooding. And then I guess on top of all of that now, the lawnmowers to mow your grass is releasing a ton of greenhouse gas emissions. So you know, it's a waste of your time and a waste of energy and releasing greenhouse gases. So just one more reason why we don't need lawns. Well, I guess, you know, less lawns is what we want to ask of people. So this is just kind of this is a really nice picture. And it just kind of shows that like we can still have some lawn for walking on and hanging out, but, you know, maybe taking half of that lawn and turning it into wild blue phlox like we have over here. And it can, you know, create a beautiful space that's still usable by people and then also has more ecological value for our birds. Right now, most of the plants, 80% of the plants in suburban and urban areas are non-native plants. And this is kind of, again, it kind of comes from Europe and from our roots and wanting to have exotic plants to kind of show how nice and fancy we were. So a lot of our really common garden plants are now these exotic European and Asian species. And they're not beneficial to us at all. And it's just kind of funny, the native plants, since they are native, they weren't considered as special. And so that has led to more than half of our gardens being these non-native plants, when really, you know, we should be like 80% native plants. That would be so much better. And, you know, if you have a couple non-natives like some tulips and roses that you like, you know, that's always great too. But just pushing for more native plants, and we have plenty of beautiful native plants. So there really is no reason why we shouldn't have more native plants. And now I am going to pass it over to Michelle, our native plant expert, and she will tell us what are native plants and why are they so important.
Thank you, Ava, and welcome everyone. So basically, a native plant is considered a plant that was here prior to European settlement. And why these plants are important is that the animals who have lived here with them for all those millennia are co-evolved or adapted to them. So they recognize them, they see them as food sources, they understand what those plants are for and how to use them. We have this thing in the native plant world, if your plant doesn't have holes in the leaves, then it's not something that you want because the insects aren't eating it. And one of the big things about plants isn't that the birds eat them directly, they eat the things that eat the plants, and that would be the insects. As Ava mentioned, insects are one of the major food sources for our small birds, our songbirds, and primarily what they feed their babies. So we want to make sure that those plants are useful and available to the insects so the birds can then eat the insects. And if you're worried about having insects in your vegetable gardens as a result of this, don't worry. I had a vegetable garden surrounded by native plants, and I very rarely had any problems with insects in my garden because the birds would eat the native plant insects and then move on into my garden and eat those insects too. So they really help in many, many ways. One other benefit is that the native plants are also for our native pollinators. And if you have a vegetable garden or a fruit orchard or anything like that, you want to have those native pollinators there to do the pollinating for you to get the fruit that you want. So lots of benefits for these native plants. So we're going to talk about some different native plant varieties, and we can go to the next slide and start out with the ones that are good for, oh, thank you. I'm glad you planted a serviceberry. That's one of my favorites. We're going to start out with those that support insects and then talk about some plants that support birds directly by the berries, fruits, nuts, nectar, and seeds that they provide. So insects need different kinds of plants. If you're not familiar with Doug Tallamy, he's a great person to get familiar with. He's an entomologist from New Jersey. His specialty is studying insect relationships with native plants and how that has repercussions in the ecosystem on up the food chain. And what they've noticed is that, number one, small birds like chickadees feed their babies primarily caterpillars, very nutritious. Someday when we change our ideas about what's good for us to eat, we'll be eating caterpillars too. They're not bad, really. I've tried some. But for right now, we'll let the birds eat them. But caterpillars are adapted to specific plants. So most of you know that monarchs eat milkweed. A lot of other caterpillars are the same way. They have specific host plants that they can eat, and they ignore everything else. So we need to plant these particular plants to attract the butterflies and moths to lay their eggs, and then the caterpillars hatch and the birds use them then to feed their babies. Doug Tallamy's done a study with this with trees and has listed the top species: oaks, willows. Here we have some here. So we've got a native species here, the oaks supporting 557 different species of caterpillars. A non-native like ginkgo, which is a great city tree because it's tolerant of pollution, but it only feeds 5 species of caterpillars. Not very useful to birds or anyone else for that matter. So definitely this is one reason why natives are important, because they support native wildlife, not just the birds, but the insects that need them specifically. All right, we can move on. So according to Doug Tallamy, the best caterpillar trees are these that are listed here. And we're going to let you know about some of the resources that he's provided. He's got 3 books out right now that are absolutely the best to use when planning for attracting wildlife to your yard. So you don't have to plant a big tree. So you don't have to have an oak necessarily. There are smaller varieties. Small trees like cherry are very good. You see maples here also. People like maple trees for their fall color, so you can plant those. So there's a good variety, and even though most of our crab apples are not native and they are what we call cultivars, they're bred specifically for a flower color or shape or the shape of the tree, they still do attract birds. I live in Detroit next to Wayne State's campus, and the campus is covered with crabapple trees. So it's really pretty this time of the year. And this is when the birds are migrating through. So migration is starting to pick up. This is like McDonald's for birds. They need a quick stop, settle down for a little while, fuel up before they continue on their way, because they're not going to stay and breed down here in this area for the most part. And so those crabapple trees attract a lot of insects, and the birds are all over them. So when I am on campus, I'll see warblers and all kinds of other small birds gleaning in among the crabapple trees, picking out those little insects that are there to pollinate the crabapple flowers. All right, so those are caterpillar trees. We can go on, and when the trees shed their leaves and they go to the ground, of course, that's a natural process. We think it's messy, so we rake them up, but those leaves are where a lot of insects and other invertebrates hide. And birds like this thrush, some of our wrens, some of our small warblers, they're ground feeders. And what they like to do is go in among these leaves and look underneath them for the insects that are there. So it's another source of food for them. Again, especially during migratory season, when these birds are heading out in the fall and going back down south. Of course, the leaves will eventually break down and also provide a healthier soil. So it's a mini ecosystem right there with the decomposers, the insects, the other invertebrates, and the birds making use of that resource. All right, we can move that to group number 2, berries and fruits. Now this is something we can benefit from as well, so this is kind of fun. There are many plants that produce berries like this elderberry here. And some of these are very high in concentrations of energy, sugar, right? And fat sometimes in the fall, which is very important for migratory birds. So not so much in the spring, of course, because we don't have fruits yet, but definitely in the fall time as they're building up their fat reserves for migration. Okay, we can, next slide, there we go. This is my favorite. If I have to recommend one native tree to plant in your yard, serviceberry is it. And I see someone here planted serviceberry, yay. It's a beautiful tree in the spring. It's blooming right now, these little white flowers. If you go past a woodland area, you'll see them as an understory tree. So they're very small compared to the other trees in a forest. They look like popcorn blooming in the forest there. And then they will leaf out and produce these small berries that eventually turn kind of a dark reddish purple. They are edible for people, but if you plant one in your yard, you probably won't get to eat any. The birds love them. They're sweet and yummy, and they just eat them up. And then after the fruiting is done and fall arrives, the serviceberry provides lovely fall color. It can be grown as a small tree or a shrub. It can be multi-stemmed or multi-trunked. So this is a great tree, and it's tolerant of a wide range of conditions. You'll see this particular picture shows it in the middle of a sunny area. But as I mentioned earlier, it's an understory tree, so you'll also see it in shady areas. I had them in both places in my yard, and they did really well. We have quite a few down here in Detroit, so it does tolerate urban and suburban conditions as well. So A number 1. Pokeweed. Now, this is a plant you may see coming up in your yard because like all plants that produce berries, they have a relationship with the animals that eat them. Inside those berries are a seed or multiple seeds. The whole job of the fruit is to attract an animal with a food source. The animal eats the fruit, goes through the digestive system, and the seeds come out with a little package of fertilizer out the other end, somewhere away from the parent plant, so that those seedlings can grow without competing with their parent. When the birds come and sit along your fence or sitting in the branches of the trees, of course, some of those little packages of fertilizer and seed come out, and you get plants you didn't expect, like pokeweed, or more likely nowadays, poison ivy. That's because the birds are eating these fruits and transporting them. But this particular plant happens to be a super food source for fall migrants, especially your thrushes, and the birds love it. However, it is toxic to people and pets. So you can't eat these berries. Your pets should not eat any part of the plant. It's very pretty. It can get very large, but you'll want to, if you have this in your yard and you want to keep it, you'll want to keep it away from your pets and small children. I used to have it in the back behind my garage. So that was a place away from everybody else. It could get big and the birds could enjoy it there. All right, so that's another good one. And next we have Eastern red cedar, which produces berries later in the year and is a good source of nutrition for birds like this cedar waxwing. It's a harder berry. It's kind of waxy, so it stays around for a long period of time. This kind of plant, as well as others that provide what we call persistent fruit, so fruits that last through the winter, cranberry, high-bush cranberry, other viburnums, hawthorn, some crab apples will provide persistent fruit. So here, like I said, down at Wayne State, we have a lot of crab apples, and some of them have persistent fruits, and the robins stick around all year round because there's enough food for them. So these kind of plants with the long hanging fruit are also very good. We have a question here, which of these trees don't attract deer? That's a tough one. Most of them do. The pricklier the tree, like this Eastern red cedar, they don't tend to munch on those quite as much because they don't like to get their soft noses in the prickles. The best part with trees is if you can kind of put a shelter around the bark. That's helpful to keep deers from rubbing against them, especially the males when they're shedding the velvet off their antlers, because that can do the most damage to trees because it can push over the entire tree or damage the bark. But for the most part, it's a game with deer, and even if some aren't particularly palatable, if the deer get hungry enough, during certain times of the year, they will still sometimes eat them or at least try them out. So that's a tough call with trees. But you want to do what you can for the birds. So nectar. We do know that hummingbirds, of course, need nectar, and they are attracted to red. So very shortly now, the wild columbine will be blooming. We have some here on campus. So this is definitely a hummingbird magnet at this time of the year because the hummingbirds will be migrating through the area before too long. Even though it doesn't look like it today with all the snow, we're thinking hummingbirds. Oh, no way. We do get some early ones sometimes, and they will be migrating from the end of this month through May. So you want to make sure you've got some things like that. You also want other nectar sources through the year, and hummingbirds don't just go to red flowers. They go to tubular flowers. So this wild bergamot, member of the mint family, has a long tubular flower that hummingbirds and hummingbird clearwing moths really love. So that's what they're looking for, is that tubular flower shape. These bloom in the summer. Then you've got other plants that bloom later through the year. Another example is trumpet vine. Great plant, hummingbird magnet, but you have to be careful with this because as a vine, it will take over the world. It does spread very aggressively, both upright or along fences. It can get into trees and cause them to get kind of weighted down and smother them. It can also start to come up from the roots if you have a lawn or garden space near it. So what I did is I had an old box elder snag in my backyard, and I planted it at the base of the box elder snag so it could just go up the dead tree trunk and I could mow around it, and I contained it that way. How does serviceberry do in the South, like North Carolina? Serviceberry has varieties, many different varieties adapted to different regions. So check with your conservation group in that area. Sometimes your watershed groups do native plant sales. Natives are native to a particular region. So when you go to buy plants at nurseries, a lot of those are not grown in Michigan. Here in Michigan, we get a lot of our plants from Oregon, Washington, and the West Coast, and also from North and South Carolina. Those may not be what we call native genotypes. Those are plants adapted to those regions. So what you want to try and do is buy native plants from native plant growers in or around your region. We do have some here in Michigan that supply these plants, and they are adapted to the climate, soil, light, and other conditions that are here in our region. So try to stick with native genotype plants. All right, nuts and seeds. So these will come later in the year, and they're for a particular group of birds that are adapted to eating nuts and seeds, like this blue jay. They will take acorns and other plant seeds and nuts like beech nuts and hazelnuts and store them. That's what caching means. So they'll just build up stores and remember where they are all winter. Blue jays are so smart, they will actually watch where the squirrels bury their nuts and seeds, and they'll remember where they are. The squirrels don't remember. The squirrels try to smell for them. They'll dig up all over your yard looking for them, but the blue jays actually remember where they store them. Chickadees will do the same thing. They will cache things and remember very well. Nuthatches. So there are a number of birds that cache seeds, and then you have a lot of birds that eat the seeds directly. So plants like this purple coneflower, and there are many different types of coneflowers, not just purple coneflower, green-headed coneflower, gray-headed coneflower. There are other native plants that produce seeds, coreopsis and tick seed plants, what we call the silphium family members. Lots of different plants produce seeds that birds will eat. We're going to cover these next week in our native plant webinar a little more in depth. But the important part here, you don't have any seeds in these plants right now with the flowers on them. They haven't been pollinated yet. They haven't started producing seeds. So what you want to do, if we go to the next slide, is make sure after they're done blooming that you leave those what we call dead heads. They're not really dead. The plant is now taking all that energy and pumping it into those seeds, making sure they have enough food to survive through the winter and then start off as little plants the next year. But all the food that's stored in that seed can also be used by the birds. So you want to leave these up as long as you can, and that way the birds can use those seeds through the winter. I don't take any of my plant material down until about the end of April, beginning of May. Insects are using those dead plant materials for shelter, and the birds will find them there and eat them. So the birds that stay through the winter need that as a food source, finding those insects among the dead plants, and they will use the seed heads through the winter as well. So it may look a little messy, but if you want to have habitat for the birds, make sure you leave those seed heads up for them and the rest of the plant material. All right, we can go on. And then birds don't just use plants for food or as a source of food for the insects that they eat, but they also, of course, shelter in them and use them as nest sites. So we're going to go to the next one here. Dense shrubbery is very good, especially for keeping birds protected from predators. So you want plants that have fairly dense growth and that will provide shelter from not only cold winter conditions and wind, but also rain, anything that we get through the year. You know, if you want to shelter, the birds probably want to be sheltering too, especially right now when it's snowing outside, right? So evergreens are particularly good for this purpose. The denser, the better. So the birds get into those little nooks and crannies and hang out there to be away from adverse conditions and predators. So it's really important to have these around as well. Now, when you're cleaning up from all that stuff that's fallen all throughout the year, and you put it in those bags and put it on the curb and it goes away, then first of all, you're not returning those nutrients to the soil, but second, you're losing out on a great resource for your birds. If possible, and this is different, you have to look at your city ordinances and codes, you can create a small brush pile in your backyard. And what this does is it gives the birds a little place to hide, it gives them a place to perch, and it also gives a place for insects to hang out, and they'll go looking for the insects. So sparrows and wrens really like these little brush piles. Wrens especially, they think these little brush piles are just the best, and sometimes they might even nest in them. So if you can do that, it's a great thing to do. So yep, you'll see these birds hanging or out in there. Towhees are one of my favorite migrants. I actually get them in my backyard here in the middle of Detroit. I'm in Midtown and we have a very tiny backyard, but we do get them here because I have created a little patch of bird habitat in this tiny backyard in the middle of Detroit. And so I do get migrants. They don't stay for the most part. I have white-throated sparrows and white-crowned sparrows and juncos right now. I have resident cardinals and woodpeckers and chickadees. And then I'll get migrants like this eastern towhee in the spring and fall. So it even works when you're here in Detroit. So not only do we need live plant material, dead plant material helps too. So I'm going to turn this over to Ava. Thanks everyone. I'll be around for questions at the end of the session.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, these dead trees are something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, especially with some of our projects around the city. The importance of dead trees and how we really need them. They're part of the habitat just as much as the living trees, and humans really, really want to cut down our dead trees, but the birds need them. Especially the soft wood is necessary for the woodpeckers to find insects. And then also the holes in the wood are really important nesting places for many, many bird species. You can see we have the tree swallows here, these red-headed woodpeckers, chickadees, titmice, and nuthatches. All of those are cavity nesting birds. So these dead trees are really important for that. And then, you know, you can have a really big tree like this. You can get birds nesting in it, like owls and other birds of prey. So it can be tricky with kind of like Michelle said, different city ordinances, and we have to be careful with when dead trees are close to houses or power lines. But I guess my rule of thumb would be if you know, if it's safe and okay, then it's definitely best to leave up that dead tree. You'll find that it becomes like a big hot spot for all of your birds. So yeah, it really becomes worth it to me. So to kind of sum everything up here today. When it comes to creating space for birds, you can start really small. You can just add one native plant to your garden, or make that decision to keep your cat inside. Over time, you can slowly reduce the amount of turf grass that you have and kind of build out more native plants and brushy areas. On this next slide here, this is an image of Portland, I believe. And oh yes, it is Portland. And all of these dots are little bits of backyard habitat. And you can see how I think there's around 3,000 here. They really add up and create a giant space for wildlife and a really big sanctuary. So every little spot makes a difference and adds up. So it's definitely worth it to create that space. By creating this space that serves birds as well as it serves us, we really have the chance to change future for our wildlife. So please consider making a little bit of space for birds. And thank you so much for joining us. We can go through questions now. So Sarah, if you want to come back and read through some of those.
We just had one come up asking if Detroit Audubon does native plant and seed swaps, and if our website has information about starting a native garden, replacing lawn. And I mean, I'll let you answer that, Ava, but we do not currently have that. But I think, Ava, maybe you can just speak quickly about Detroit Bird City, about that programming maybe.
Yeah, yeah, we don't do any native plant swaps. We have thought about it. I love the idea, but we haven't been there yet. And then we are working on our Detroit Bird City project, where we are actually taking some underutilized parks that are owned by the city, but the city doesn't have funding for park upkeep to keep the park as an active park. So we have been kind of repurposing those parks and restoring them into wildflower meadows. So that's a much larger scale. Some of them are larger, some are still pretty small. But yeah, going through that process of taking big areas of turf grass and turning them into wildflower areas. So we're actually kind of in the process of learning more about it ourselves. Online, we do have a like a PDF or packet all about gardening for birds. And then we will send out our resource packet that goes over a lot of this information. It's kind of like a brief rundown of everything that we've talked about. And then it also includes some of our favorite books and some websites for information, and then also some websites where you can buy plants, native Michigan plants, the places that we like to go to. So yeah, lots of good information in there.
Thank you. We had a question if pokeweed is sold anywhere. Michelle, if you wanted to answer that, that came to me directly.
Sure. The answer there is no. It's considered a weed. And so it is not sold anywhere that I'm aware of. One of the things with plants that produce fruit that makes them a little hard to propagate is oftentimes that fruit has to pass through an animal's digestive system before the seeds can germinate. So they can be kind of tricky to grow. But because that one is a native plant, but considered a weed and it can be toxic, it is not typically grown. It tends to pop up all by itself though, because birds do love it. And when they sit on your fence or tree branch, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes those seeds come out and you get one unexpectedly. Here I am down in the city. I have a small native plant garden behind one of our biological sciences buildings in a little 4-foot, really terrible strip of ground directly adjacent to an asphalt driveway, and there's a pokeweed coming up there. I left it because it's fine with me. It's not harming anybody. It's out of the way, and it provides a good food source for the birds. But they just pop up on their own pretty much. And they have fairly extensive root systems, so you can't dig them up and move them either.
Interesting.
Oh, so someone did find pokeweed at Stage Nature Center, which is in Troy, and I know they're having a native plant sale coming up relatively soon, so that might be a place. But again, that's one, if you have small children or pets, I don't recommend it for a place where they would be in your yard. You want to keep it away from them.
Great, thank you. The last question I'm seeing was about what the term native means. She had read that native means within 30 miles of your home. Is that true?
There's a big discussion about what native actually means. So my best resource for this, I go to the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, and I can drop that link in the chat here shortly. What they did was they took survey records from the early 1800s, and the surveyors would note the plant material that was in the area, especially the trees, and they figured out pretty much what habitats were endemic to the various counties of Michigan, and they made a map. So you can actually go to the Michigan Natural Features Inventory site, look up your county, and look up what kind of habitats were in that region, and look at each of those habitats individually on their site and find out the basic types of plants that were there. Another great source is the series called Michigan Flora by Ed Voss, which has since been updated and condensed into a single book with Tony Reznicek. And they have the appearances of native plants in each of the counties of Michigan. So if you want to be really specific, you can use those resources to determine what's native to your specific zone. That doesn't mean it's going to grow there now. Detroit used to be Lake Plain Prairie. Obviously, we are not that anymore. So I can't really grow Lake Plain Prairie plants in my backyard, or wetland plants for the most part. So we kind of say native to the region. So you can say southeastern lower Michigan. Sometimes we actually even stretch it to be the Great Lakes region. So Minnesota, Wisconsin, part of Pennsylvania, northern Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio have about the same ecotone, ecosphere, eco conditions that we have. So even if the plant isn't directly from here, it should grow here and provide the ecosystem resources that plants need. Keep in mind also, there are some natives that are aggressive and invasive. Canada goldenrod, beautiful plant, attracts a lot of pollinators, great for monarchs in the fall, super aggressive, not something you want to plant in a small yard. Even common milkweed, same way. So native doesn't necessarily mean A, it's going to grow in your yard, and B, that you want to grow it in your yard. So you have to kind of be judicious about what you plant. And we'll talk more about that next week at the webinar next week.
Yes, thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Ava. She lost internet again, so that was good timing though. But thank you all for coming. And like Michelle has said, we have the second part of this webinar is next Tuesday at the same time. If you haven't registered, come and hear more and more and more about native plants. And please reach out if you have any questions. I will be sending out a recording within a few days with all of the resources that were shared and talked about. And if you have any other questions, please reach out. We are happy to help, and Michelle and Ava are always happy to talk about plants and birds. So have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.